If you spend enough time in wartime archives, diaries and oral histories, you eventually come across techniques that feel almost too simple to be real. The trick you're about to learn is one of those methods. It's the quiet, uncelebrated food preservation hack that kept countless European families alive during the harshest winters of the Second World War. Households that had no electricity, no refrigeration, no access to fresh produce for months at a time turned to a method so basic and so practical that it's almost shocking it isn't mainstream today. Civilians packed root vegetables into sealed barrels, layering each harvest batch with dry salt. Not brine, not pickling, not fermentation, just clean vegetables, clean salt, and an airtight container. Done right, these families could pull out carrots in February that were almost as firm as they were in October. Before we dive into the mechanics, let me give you a proper doorway into this topic. During the winter of 1941, in parts of Eastern Europe, temperatures routinely dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Supply routes froze, trains stopped, entire towns were forced to rely on whatever they had put aside months earlier. In testimonies recorded decades later, people recalled opening those salt-packed barrels in January and feeling an almost indescribable relief. These weren't luxury foods. They were survival calories. Yet the fact that this system worked so consistently across countries, climates and war conditions tells us that this is more than a gimmick. It's engineering through necessity. And that's why today, for this episode, we're going to break down exactly how this preservation technique functioned, why it worked, and how it performs when tested with modern produce. This isn't nostalgia. This is a working survival method worth knowing, especially if self-reliance or long-term food stability matters to you. WWII civilians relied on a simple interaction between salt and moisture to preserve root crops. At the heart of the method is the way dry salt regulates moisture migration. Salt doesn't just dry things out, it stabilizes them by preventing microbial growth. Root vegetables contain natural sugars and a surprising amount of surface moisture. Under normal cellar conditions, that moisture is enough to allow mold, bacteria and soft rot to slowly take hold. Once that process starts, rot spreads from one vegetable to the next through microscopic contact points. Wartime civilians understood that isolating each vegetable in a thin shield of salt acted like placing a desiccant layer between them. The salt wickered away just enough surface moisture to prevent decomposition, but not enough to shrivel the produce. So, when it comes to the interaction between salt and moisture, well, the whole system really hinges on balance. Salt draws water out of the vegetables, you see, but not so aggressively that it dries them out completely. Instead, it creates an environment where spoilage bacteria struggle to survive, but the vegetables themselves stay, reasonably firm and edible. The trick was always to keep just enough moisture in the mix. Too little, and the vegetables shrivel. Too much, and you risk rot. It's a dance, really, between preservation and palatability, all orchestrated by the humble handful of salt. Carrots, beets, turnips, radishes, rutabagas and parsnips all lend themselves to this method. They have tough skins and minimal internal water migration, which makes them ideal candidates. The goal wasn't to cure the vegetables like meat. It was to slow time down. Everything in the setup revolved around controlling airflow, moisture and bacterial exposure. Salt was simply the cheapest, most available tool civilians had to achieve that in a world where refrigeration was non-existent for most households. Successful preservation depended on careful preparation long before the vegetables ever touched salt. Families didn't just yank the vegetables out of the ground and toss them into a barrel. That's a modern misconception. The produce had to be freshly harvested, handled gently, and never washed. Washing vegetables introduces excess water that works directly against the salt's moisture control function. Instead, civilians brushed off soil with cloth or straw, kept the skins fully intact, and trimmed foliage cleanly without cutting into the vegetable shoulders. The barrels themselves were just as critical. Most families used wooden or ceramic vessels, though metal lids were common. The goal was to create a stable, airtight environment. Any tiniest crack invited humidity swings, which allowed the salt to clump unevenly and created pockets where mold could develop. Before the layering process even began, some households dried their barrels over a stove or set them in the sun to eliminate internal moisture. A small step, but one that significantly improved results. All right, let's dive into the meticulous preparation phase. This is where the magic begins, folks. The layering technique was straightforward but incredibly precise when done correctly. They poured a shallow layer of dry salt, about a finger's thickness, onto the bottom of the barrel. Then came the first layer of vegetables placed in a single spaced-out layer. The key was zero contact. Each carrot, beet or turnip had to be surrounded by a buffer of salt. A second layer of salt was added on top, filling every gap, every corner and every curve. Then another layer of vegetables. Then more salt. And so on, until the barrel was full. The final layer always had to be salt, sealing the entire contents beneath a dry, oxygen-resistant crust. It was tedious work, but the results justified every minute invested. Families routinely stored 30 to 50 kilograms of root vegetables this way, pulling them out throughout the winter in excellent condition. If any moisture pooled at the bottom of the barrel, which was rare but possible, the entire batch risked spoilage. That's why a small slanted board or stand under the barrel was sometimes used to encourage drainage. For this episode, we rebuilt the method from scratch. We used a food-grade plastic barrel to replicate the sealed environment, though wooden vessels still perform beautifully. Our test batch included modern carrots, beets, potatoes, and parsnips. The first observation was immediate. Even in today's controlled agriculture, unwashed vegetables behave far better in this system. Washed carrots softened noticeably faster. Unwashed ones remained firm. After 8 weeks, the differences became even clearer. The carrots and beets stored in salt were dramatically firmer and more vibrant than those kept in a modern root cellar. Mold was non-existent. Scent was clean. Texture was almost fresh. The potatoes, however, showed mixed results. Their higher internal moisture makes them more sensitive, and while they were still edible, they softened slightly more than ideal. The parsnips, on the other hand, looked almost unchanged. By week 12, the salted produce continued to outperform modern cellar storage. This tested, modern-proof system confirms that the wartime method wasn't just folklore. It holds up under real conditions. For this episode, we rebuilt the method from scratch. We used a food-grade plastic barrel to replicate the sealed environment, though wooden vessels still perform beautifully. Our test batch included modern carrots, beets, potatoes, and parsnips. The first observation was immediate. Even in today's controlled agriculture, unwashed vegetables behave far better in this system. Washed carrots softened noticeably faster. Unwashed ones remained firm. After 8 weeks, the differences became even clearer. The carrots and beets stored in salt were dramatically firmer and more vibrant than those kept in a modern root cellar. Mould was non-existent. Scent was clean. Texture was almost fresh. The potatoes, however, showed mixed results. Their higher internal moisture makes them more sensitive, and while they were still edible, they softened slightly more than ideal. The parsnips, on the other hand, looked almost unchanged. By week 12, the salted produce continued to outperform modern cellar storage. This tested, modern-proofed system confirms that the wartime method wasn't just folklore. It holds up under real conditions. If you want to use this technique for your own long-term food independence, the process is refreshingly accessible. Start with a sealed container. Ceramic, plastic or wood all work. Choose fresh, unwashed root vegetables. Brush them clean. Lay down your salt bed. Place your vegetables with spacing, then bury them in salt. Seal the container and store it somewhere cool and stable. A basement, earth-bagged shed, or any shaded corner that stays between 0 and 10 degrees Celsius is ideal. The method scales easily. A beginner can start with a small bucket to learn the moisture behavior before committing to a full barrel. A more experienced survivalist can maintain multiple containers, staggering harvests to create a year-round rotation. Homesteaders can combine this with dehydration, fermentation, and cold room strategies to build diversified food security. This simple wartime trick remains one of the most practical lessons in food independence. When you study history long enough, you realize that wartime civilians developed systems out of necessity that still outperform many modern conveniences. The salted root vegetable barrel isn't glamorous, it isn't technological, but it works, and it worked when entire families depended on it for survival. If you value historical knowledge that can be put directly into practice, this method deserves a place in your toolkit. If you learned something valuable from this guide, remember to subscribe, share this episode with fellow history enthusiasts, and help keep these forgotten frontline skills alive.